Today we are going to talk about the biggest change to Apple iOS operating system since its introduction in 2007, 6 years ago. This improvement will have a strong design and technological impact on existing prospective applications. Please join Globant in analyzing these changes and assessing the impact on the current landscape of apps. We will hold a Q&A session at the end of the webinar where we will review specific questions. This is just a quick introduction about Globant. And these are going to be our three speakers of today. First, we're going to hear Javier Siman, VP Mobile Engineer at Globant. Then we are going to listen to Venkat Ram. He's a professor of management at Boston University. And at the end, we're going to hear Pete Petras, the Director of UI and UX at Globant. Our first speaker is Javier, and he's going to talk about iOS 7 new features, iOS 7 for business, and iOS 7 for devs and Xcode 5.
The photos introduce a very new feature around sharing the photo stream, and then we have a new Safari, the introduction of iTunes Radio. This is something that Apple has seen in the market and wanted to introduce as part of their platform, and some other features. So I'm going to make a special focus on those that affect the way we develop applications. So we have multitasking. So of course, multitasking is something that was present on the very first iOS version. It's a modern operating system, so it is able to multitask. The thing is that multitasking wasn't open to third-party developers. So even though you were able to switch between applications, your third-party applications weren't able to run on the background. Some of the Apple applications were able to run on the background. Some very obvious examples are the telephone, the messaging application. Those are applications that need to run on the background. So multitasking was there before, but it is now open for developers and application development to be leveraged with. And another feature that we all know is Siri. Siri is something that was introduced not long ago, but it was confined to what Apple decided to make out of Siri. Now Siri is open to developers, so you are able to code into Siri. You can, if you're coding your food delivery application, then you can interface with Siri to ask Siri, I want food delivery from hamburgers around where I am now. So that's something also introduced in this version. AirDrop is something something that was present on the desktop version of the Mac OS. It's a way of sharing content with nearby devices. So now you can share. So it was introduced before, the way to share content with messages, Twitter in the latest version, and email. Now we are adding AirDrop with the same interface for sharing your content now with nearby iOS devices. So what about compatibility? So Apple extended the compatibility reach down to iPhone 4. So iPhone 3GS is no longer supported by iOS 7, and that will keep on. So it's pretty much deprecated at this time. iPad 1 also is deprecated from this version on, and these are the most relevant implications of iOS backwards compatible. So so this is my favorite. So if I had to choose the single most important feature group that was introduced with iOS, with this version of iOS, would be the integration with the enterprise. Apple realized that that the enterprise mobility is the fastest growing segment within mobile. So this is driven because what we call consumerization of IT, that is consumers wanting to have the same kind of behavior in their everyday life at their work. This is not the first time we've seen this kind of behaviors. Long ago, we had the web, and later on, the intranets were introduced. So that was one of the first cases of consumerization of IT. So that's the trend that's going to keep on growing, and the gap will be smaller and smaller every time. So with iOS 7, Apple introduces a group of features divided, I would say, into two subgroups. One is the ability to manage your device from a third party, that is, your IT administrators are able to manage your device, and the other is the set of features that are now open to developers to develop applications on the enterprise. I'm going to go very quick on some of the most important ones. Opening management. Opening management means that if you receive an email with a PDF and it's your enterprise device, then your IT administrator is allowed to set what can you do with your attachments. So let's say you receive a confidential PDF, then you're not allowed to open your PDF with Dropbox. So you're not able to share your application. You have a specific VPN for application. So you can run applications behind the firewall, and some other features. Let's get this. So MDM enrollment. So for those of you that had Blackberries in the past, company-owned Blackberries in the past, then you know that from the moment that you get your Blackberry, that Blackberry is already signed in within your company. Well, that's something that nowadays, if you have an Android or an iOS device, then you have to do manually. So with iOS 7, you can factory set your company settings, so you don't have to do that anymore. A single sign-on, you can develop multiple applications for your company, and the user doesn't have to log in over and over again. That is an increase of security because the user doesn't have to type the password more than one time, as opposed to the ones that think that that poses a security risk. Data protection within your device, that's encrypted with your password, with your single sign-on password or your password. You can store securely information on your device. And well, there's probably some other features that you can add. So the last topic that I want to cover for this technical portion of the webinar is how it changes the way we develop. So there have been some major changes in UI that in the UI and how the UI behaves that also determines that you have to code differently and you have different UI interfaces. There's a whole guide to that on how to adapt how to adapt your current interface UIs to the new settings. And well, and then there's multitasking. So the implications for a developer from the multitasking point of view and what you can do with multitasking is not just your application running on the background. The implications of multitasking is that you are allowed to schedule as an application developer. You are allowed to schedule background jobs. So this is a major breakthrough for applications that need to download content. You don't need to open your application to download your content. You can configure your application to download either your subscription or data updates or whatever you feel like the user doesn't have to wait till the application is open for actively downloading. Some of the changes for the gaming industry is that Apple has taken from some of the frameworks that have been around for some time now and have built in with the iOS. So, for example, if you were to develop applications using Cocos, which was the Sprite 2D framework, then now Apple integrated such functionality within your within the frameworks. Another major breakthrough for developers is you have more control over what you can do with embedded maps. So you can actually interact more than just stay in a location, which was what you could do before on your maps. And so this is what I'm going to close with. A special note on upgrading applications. Well, this is kind of small, but I don't know if you can notice that if you take your existing application and you decided to compile it and run it on iOS7, then it's not as simple as it's supposed to be. So if you have custom components, then it will most likely break down. Toolbars usually break. If you can see on the upper section, the left one is running on iOS7, the right one is running on iOS 6, which is the way it was designed for. So you see that the header toolbar is broken. You see that the sliders on the bottom are also broken, overlaid with the subsequent lines, so they hide. So these are some of the considerations that you need to take while upgrading your application. It's not just recompiling and getting the deprecated methods out of the way as it was with previous iOS releases. And that's all for the technical session. And I'm gonna bestow the presentership to Venkat Raman. So. Venkat, I made you presenter, right?
Okay. Thank you, Javier. Thank you, Andrew. What you've described is a very useful way to understand the major shifts that have gone on in the features and functionality of iOS. What I like to do is to get us to think about how important is this. Is it simply another software upgrade, or is it much more fundamental for the next phase of Apple? And obviously, I have carried out a lot of research in the last few years looking at the digital impacts on different sectors. And one of the clear trends that's coming out is the importance of software and the importance of operating system, the importance of applications, the importance of the features and the functionality that have been described so far. So I want to use that as the basis to juxtapose the technical features that have been described so far with the broader business implications for or what this means for Apple, and more importantly, what this means for all the various companies that may be using Apple devices. So the starting point really is to think about this as we are in the post-PC era. Tablets outsell PCs in 2013. That trend is very clear. Both PCs and laptops are going to lose out to some other form factor defined by tablets and the mobile devices. But over the last 2-3 years, as we have seen the variety of applications and the apps that have been developed by wonderful set of developers all over the world, it's clear that the tablets are being used for not just for consumption, like reading the magazine or reading a report, or reading a book or watching a television or watching movies, but also for content creation, including enterprises and businesses. A lot more applications, whether it's in healthcare or in airlines or in retail, are now becoming tablet enabled, and that's a big trend. And obviously, once you make it enterprise enabled, the security, privacy, as well as the ease of use become important. And many of the features that have been described so far are keeping in line with what Apple is trying to do with this in the future. But we also need to think about the post-PC era, not in terms of the devices that we know, but the devices that could emerge over the next few years. Just like the first personal computer, whether it is the Apple or the Microsoft/IBM PC, focused on simple applications like word processing or Excel spreadsheet, we should not be constrained by how we think about the apps today, but the apps are going to evolve as the form factor evolves from what we know towards things that are going to be wearable computing, whether that's something around your wrist that we see today with Nike, today with Jobit, but also we could think about watches that are going to be launched by Samsung and maybe other companies in the future. So in my view, Apple's next big innovation frontier will depend on the iOS 7. So to me, iOS 7 is not just another OS upgrade, but a fundamental way in which we will see whether Apple is going to be the undisputed leader in the future, or it's going to go along the way of many of these leaders that we have seen in the recent past. So if you look at this slide, what we really see are leaders that were very successful just a few years back. A few years back, Nokia was an undisputed leader in terms of devices pretty much all over the world. Then it was the GSM network. BlackBerry, clearly the undisputed leader when it comes to enterprise emails. The Symbian operating system, Palm, Motorola with this really interesting and innovative devices, or for that matter, Sony in Japan working with Ericsson in Stockholm, creating a joint venture that brought some of the early attempts at music, some of the early attempts at pictures, and for that matter, videos into the mobile devices. And let's not forget that Microsoft Windows CE was one of the first ones from an operating system point of view to go from desktop to the non-desktop world. But what happened to them? What happened to these leaders? They really failed to recognize the shifts because they were successful. BlackBerry thought that the single app that they controlled, BlackBerry Messenger, and the functionality and the design features and the form and function that BlackBerry provided would be enough. They laughed when Apple introduced the iOS without any physical keypad and created the software-enabled keypad, and BlackBerry thought that was not the future. Similarly, Nokia, similarly, Sony Ericsson. So the point that I want to make as you think about iOS 7 is how much of this is an evolutionary shift that is necessary for Apple to go from being focused on devices like the mobile devices and the tablet to the kinds of new devices that are going to be increasingly required for Apple to be considered an innovation. And so in that way, I look at iOS 7 as a very important part of what Apple needs to do. But then let's look at iOS 7 in the context of the hardware integration. What we learned from the PC era is once Microsoft had a lock-in on the operating system, Windows, many of the device manufacturers were essentially resellers of Windows Intel architecture. In other words, the Windows Intel architecture was more important in terms of value creation and capture than the manufacturers themselves. So companies like Dell and Acer and Lenovo were essentially resellers of the Windows Intel architecture. But in terms of the mobile devices, something interesting is happening. device companies are wanting to increasingly exercise greater control. So what we have in today's leaderboard are really two different models of hardware-software integration. Apple has very tightly linked hardware-software integration, as we all know. On the other hand, there is something interesting happening between Google, Samsung, and Motorola. Before Google bought Motorola, we would have said Google is following the strategy very similar to what Windows did with its operating system, where the Google will make Android pretty much available to anybody for free or very low price, happy and content to make money with advertising and other services. Then he decided to buy Motorola, and obviously the Moto X is the first real product coming out of Motorola. That's part of Google. So Google competes against Samsung with its Motorola division, and Google cooperates with Samsung because Samsung is the largest developer in the sense of hardware for the Google Android. So as we look at the importance of iOS, it is important to also recognize the competitive landscape in which Apple iOS is positioned. It is positioned in a very dynamic marketplace where Google both competes and cooperates with the hardware device manufacturers. Then I want us to also think about the importance of the third operating system. In most markets, it's never going to be a duopoly. There will always be the jockeying for third and the fourth. And here in the operating system world, there's at least 3 companies that are jockeying for third position. Clearly, there's Windows and Windows Phone. The early indications are that it's not getting the kind of traction that Steve Ballmer would like, but that doesn't mean that we can rule them out as quickly. Then there is BlackBerry that's now exploring a variety of strategic options. It knows that it cannot exist by itself. So the question is, who will BlackBerry join? Will BlackBerry be part of the Windows ecosystem, or will BlackBerry be part of the Samsung ecosystem, or will BlackBerry be bought by some other Asian companies? Those are all open questions, and we will know answers very, very soon. At the same time, Samsung is quietly working on its own operating system, Tizen, and many of the features and functionality, as you think about iOS7, could have implications for how Apple differentiates itself compared to Samsung in the coming years. So iOS7 is a very important part for Apple to compete, to maintain its number 1/number 2 position, while the number 3 is quickly gained. So as such, it's not one more upgrade, but an important part of Apple's history. So that brings me to the slide on Apple at the inflection point. So as you look at all these features, as you look at the technical features of iOS, ask yourself the question, how important is this for Apple in terms of its maintaining the profit share? We know that Apple iOS is not the leader in market share, but Apple iOS and iPhone is the leader in profit share. Samsung has gained also in profit share in the first half of this year. So if you look at the entire mobile industry today, Apple and Samsung together make up 103% of the industry profit, and every other company in the industry loses 3%. So you have 2 dominant players that make up 103%. So highly skewed in terms of what's happening. And 2 years back, Apple had 75% of the industry profit, but now it's down to 50%. So that's what I mean by the inflection point. So iOS is very important for them to both defend its position as well as expand. The other reason why Apple is at the inflection point is all the iOS that Apple has offered so far were essentially defined by Scott Forstall and during the Steve Jobs era. So this is the first time that is under Tim Cook's era. It's under Johnny Ive, and it'll be interesting to see the organizational adjustments that they have made to make hardware, software much more integrated work, not only for tablet, but also beyond tablets. Then I want us to focus on the iOS 7 ecosystem because this is important as we all realize that the success of iOS is not under the control of Apple. Success of iOS is under the control of the ecosystem. And ecosystem here has free apps and paid apps. First hand, you got software systems where you got free apps and paid apps. And then support and commitment of not only the developers, but also more importantly, the telecom operators. So the Verizons, the AT&Ts, the Vodafones, the Orange, and Telefonica, all providing support to the ecosystem. And increasingly, iOS7 will also define how much Apple is able to make inroads into China with its own set of evolution of the infrastructure. So this ecosystem becomes important. So do not look at the iOS7 features as something that only Apple can control, that the ecosystem needs to control, which means all the features and functionality that Heavyism is highlighted for us become important for the developers to create compelling apps that make all of us as end consumers wanting to use iOS to make it a success. Then I want to really get us thinking about the architectural control beyond mobile devices that we know. While we look at the data and know that the mobile devices still have a lot of growth to go, the high end is already getting saturated. People are not upgrading in the 2-year life cycle because many of the apps work reasonably well. So Apple's ecosystem is going to evolve beyond phone and tablet. And today we've already seen 3 possible trajectories. One is the trajectory around the media web, around television. The second one is something that's wearable in our hand. And Tim Cook has said publicly that something around the wrist is of immense interest to Apple. Just like what Tim Cook has said, the living room and television is of immense interest to Apple. And then the third interesting dimension is iOS in the car. Now, BlackBerry, as many of you may know, has the QNX operating system software that is being used by many car manufacturers to create embedded apps. But the penetration of iOS in the car with ADQ sitting on Fiat and other Italian companies' boards is also an indication of the importance that they put in the automobile as they seek to expand iOS beyond the mobile devices. So again, all this is to come back to get us thinking about the iOS 7 as a very important part of Apple's future. So the design's importance is to excite the developers to create apps that will work on the Apple devices, and the Apple devices are beyond what we know today. Energize the users to think beyond phones and tablets, to continually think about other wearable devices and so on. And we all know that Apple's market position is based on how well they integrate hardware and software. So ultimately, it's not just going to be the software and the app, but how well it does on new and exciting form factors and new and exciting devices. So I believe that iOS design is the foundation for Apple's success in this decade. So Tim Cook will be defined by how well he makes success out of iOS and to make it a successful part for Apple going forward. So with that, let me turn it over to Pete to wrap up this part of the webinar.
So thank you for that. My name is Pete Petrus, Director UI UX at Globant here in San Francisco. I'm going to actually bring this back down from the broader picture that Venkat had been talking about as far as Apple and the relevancy of iOS to specifically the differences between iOS 6 and iOS 7 and how that can actually be translated to and how it can actually impact design and what are the opportunities. So first we'll talk about a few things here. Overall, we're going to talk about flat design and is it a trend or not? What has changed in iOS 7 the design challenges there, and then ultimately ending with what are the opportunities. Javier had mentioned a lot of the opportunities on the development side, and I think on the design side of things, those two elements work hand in hand, and we'll get to those. To understand is flat design a trend or not, we first have to understand what actually flat design is. Flat design is a design movement or a philosophy which allows the user interface to skew more towards a functional side over the aesthetic elements. Elements like gradients, beveled edges, reflections, etc., these become intrusive and unnecessary. You can see here with the global iconography, the icon set that they've have created, as well as the Google Now app. These really reflect what the flat design is, allowing superfluous elements such as title descriptions to be irrelevant, whereas the actual title itself becomes very relevant and obvious. To understand what flat design is, we also have to understand what flat design is not. Ultimately, with iOS 7, Apple announced that it would scrap their quote-unquote traditional look of their mobile apps, which mimic the real-world objects. This is referred to in the industry as skeuomorphic design, the trend towards skeuomorphism, where the user interface mimics the real world, such as wood, metal, and glass. These things actually compete with the actual data being represented. Flat design places the importance of data front and center and doesn't have these competitive elements. A core factor of what flat design is all about is actually the use of color. Use of color is very key, allowing supersaturated bright colors and a skew towards monotone elements becomes very important. Color palettes expand from your typical 1, 2 colors to 5 or more colors, very bright or associated systems that are typically used to distinguish one from another. Here you can see the status or mood being indicated by colors such as blue for rainy, cloudy times, or yellow for sunny times. These are actually emotional elements that are actually brought forth with the use of appropriate color within flat design. Type is a very important element in flat design. The typography or font is typically bold and clean. This becomes a hallmark in the flat design philosophy, where data and content become the design-centered element. Scale becomes also important, allowing the interface to show hierarchy and associations with titles. This allows the UI to be as clean as possible. And ultimately, understanding how flat design has its pros and cons. The early adoption of flat design philosophy came from Microsoft with the launch of Windows 8. This was a big, bold move. This combines all the elements I spoke before into what Microsoft refers to as tiles, the interface allowing you to see a number of elements at a glance and associate those with color, iconography, different styles, and be able to actually jump and drill down deeper into the interface without being ultimately more intrusive. The pros here are improved device performance, improved usability, reduced resource reliance, and obviously no skeuomorphism. The cons here are, is this a possible trend? We're not sure yet. Overcrowding versus differential. And then, ultimately the correlation with the actual brand. With flat design, you do become an element of the UI that sits to the background. And how do you actually distinguish yourself as a brand becomes another question. Next, we'll move on to what actually changed in iOS 7. There's a lot of things to cover, and this is the first high-level element that I kind of identify some of the core elements. Apple has done a great element of documenting some of the ways to transition, as Javier mentioned earlier. But really, we wanted to look at, ultimately, where's iOS 6 been, and where are we going with iOS 7? iOS 6 is basically 6 generations of products all collected in one place. Time has allowed a diverse visual language to come out of Apple. It all started with the Aqua-inspired original OS X, uber glossy pill-like apps, containers. Here you can see it with messages and then the weather app. So the skeuomorphic realistic language of the notes and newsstand. These obviously don't have one visual language, as you see over to the right with iOS 7. Here's a quick snapshot of a number of different elements that have changed. And you can see how things become a little bit more consistent, from the ultimately dialing using the phone as what it's intended to be, a telephone, to the other apps such as stocks, to the settings, to other core features like the clock or even the game center. And obviously, the iconography is a key component of that. Here you can see a quick understanding and translation of what are the core Apple apps and how do they translate to this new flat design that they've initiated in iOS 7. Overall, the look and feel, it's the first major redesign since the iPhone launched back in 2007. This ultimately means that the flat design focuses on the minimalist iconography, translucent windows, modern and thin typeface updates, content-first approach, really making the iOS interface secondary to the content. Ultimately, a lot of this is also attributed to the new font. Apple chose to use Helvetica Neue Ultralight as a base element for their new interface. This is a way to actually play with scale and give titles their relevancy and their prominence without actually competing with the core elements that might be the content. In this case, you can see either Siri on the left or iTunes on the right. Depending on what is the actual information hierarchy that's needed for the user, this allows it to actually play well without being too heavy and intrusive on the overall interface. Third, we're going to go into some of the design challenges. With this new design, it poses a lot of design challenges to actually do some of the translation. Javier mentioned earlier on where on the technical side, it's not just as easy as a direct one-to-one translation. There are a lot of little elements to take into consideration. These also need to be taken in as far as the design goes. Bezels, gradients, drop shadows, they can lead to a more complex and heavier UI. So these have been reduced. The translucent panels here allow the user to see hints of what is still happening in the background, keeping the user orientated to provide more context throughout their experience. The use of white space makes important content and functionality more noticeable and focused. The less visual complexity and the more focus you have really allows this to be a core focused product. The use of color is used specifically to denote interactivity. This creates focus and establishes hierarchy between content and functional elements on the screen. In this case, you can see whether you're in the notes or whether you're in Mail, you have similar interactions, similar elements, but the use of color really identifies what are the elements that you can use as far as the tools or navigation throughout the application. And this introduction of borderless buttons. Bezels are a thing of the past. The reliance on dimensional buttons are replaced with more meaningful titles, and the system colors show what is interactive versus passive. The contact page here uses the system color blue to show users what actually are the interactive elements. This is a theme that goes throughout the whole entire iOS system. Ultimately coming down to designing for the framework. So UI elements provided by the framework can be broken down into these core categories. Bars, where contextual information and navigation is housed. Content, app-specific enabled interaction, models and behaviors are located. Controls, where you perform actions. And then temporary views, things that appear briefly to give users important information, but not taking over completely. You can see here where you have the nav bar, segmented control. Through the nav view, you have the alert. And then down below, the tab bar versus toolbar buttons. And ultimately, when designing for iOS 7 broadly, beyond just understanding the core iOS 7 redesign, programmatically with UI view, UI elements are considered to be types of views. They inherit from the UI view architecture here. A viewer knows how to draw itself on the screen, and it knows that the user touches itself within the boundaries. Hierarchy of views allow functional elements to live on top of one another harmoniously. Here's an example of how views and view controllers can be combined to present the UI of an iOS app. So when designing for iOS, there are multiple elements and multiple layers that can actually be taken in consideration when taking elements into place, such as the custom view, the navigation view, top bar view, the window itself, and then how is that all actually assembled. And ultimately, anonymity is another element that's quite a design challenge. iOS 7 does not broadcast a unique MAC address any longer. All broadcasts that have the same number. This all addresses privacy concerns of any current identifier. We'll increase standardization on app advertising identifiers, and developers and networks all should switch to IDFA at this point. Ultimately, this leads us to what are the actual opportunities. These are a quick swatch of the opportunities that we've identified, but obviously there are numerous others. First, the use of the whole screen. A common theme within iOS 7 is to remove the frame, thinking of the phone as the actual physical frame with the app embodied within it. A secondary frame is irrelevant in this case. This allows focus on the core functionality. And these iOS 7 themes can inform the design. Here you see the weather app where the pertinent information of the actual location and the temperature is most important. The secondary information of the actual weather identified by the visualization is the overall background, which becomes a theme and an idea and more of a feeling. The secondary information down below for the forecast becomes very clear and concise and very usable. No other elements that are unnecessary are actually present. The element of discovery is actually interesting. The vertical layout of the actual App Store reverts back to iOS 5. This increases discoverability, showing more apps at one glance. So it's interesting that iOS 7 is actually reverted back to the ability to actually see more rather than less in this case. Popular Near Me sorts apps by use and downloaded relevancies to a user's location. So geographic location is a key element. Data is customized but not personalized. And that geospecific services allow for targeted marketing campaigns to really drive these usage. Taking advantage of the user discovery is enabled by the design. And earlier we'd mentioned how productivity and multitasking is actually taken into consideration. You know, before multitasking was limited just to a few apps, as Javier mentioned earlier. But today it's really open to all of the other apps and how they can actually work together. All apps running in the background, they're prioritized according to usage. Apps downloaded in the background, user notifications to trigger content in the background, and wide power management improvements have been made. Quick toggles for settings. Additional items can be displayed in layers as well towards the bottom of the screen. This allows items in reminders to be shown as a user can expand each layer as they go. And transitions. Transitions become very important. With the obvious focus on the current date here in the calendar, this uses transitions from zooming in and out, giving users a sense of depth as they move in between years, months, and dates. Each view comes into focus, allowing relevant information to be displayed. In the day view, the user doesn't really need to see the whole entire month, but the date within the week is important and useful. Again, removing any additional information that's not particularly necessary, but having a key understanding and a cue for a user to understand where they came from and where they could go back to. And all this requires interactivity. The one thing iOS 7 did not do is change any of the interactivity. The interactivity that's been trained throughout all the generations of iOS has been very successful. Users are comfortable with the standard gestures. These all stay the same. Tapping, dragging, flicking, swiping, double tap, the infamous pinch and zoom, touch and hold, and even shake. They all remain the same, and they all allow a user to apply these to the current designs. And last, I'll end with one of the other elements around transitions. The previous retained gestures allow these transitions to use these layers to swipe through and move and reveal launch content. iOS uses a parallax effects to show various layers, utilizing the X, Y, and Z axis. Here in tabs, or even transitioning between screens in settings or in mail, allow this multi-layered effect for an interface. This really allows this to open up to the way actually designers ultimately can design and approach a rich user experience for designing for the Apple iOS.